This is the
Five Starr
Podcast.
Let me talk to you. This is such good shit.
What do you guys want to talk about?
You know, it's odd. I've been on YouTube since, long before I was ever doing podcasts. A lot of you might not know this, for the few of you that are consistently watching anyway, but there's a whole other former channel that I used to keep active that I sort of did away with and made private for reasons that I'm not going to go into now. But when we started the FSWR channel back in, I think sometime in mid-2019, there was a period where I took a bit of a hiatus because of the whole scamdemic era of wrestling that just rubbed me the wrong way and made me never want to watch the product again. It was totally unwatchable. So I've really only been actively doing this for about a year and a half now. And since then, there's been a moderate bit of growth, nothing too impactful. And part of that's my fault for not doing a better job getting my brand out there. Part of it's the way YouTube algorithms work in 2023. It's why you'll always hear me tell you to hit the like button or leave a comment, because subscriptions don't really mean a whole lot on YouTube at this point. And I'm not exaggerating when I say that. You know, videos get recommended through titles, likes, viewing activity, thumbnails. It's a completely screwed up system with the way these platforms have changed the game. When I was growing up, man, YouTube was a totally different animal. And that's why I've used secondary platforms like Rumble as backup options in case that things ever go sideways with the YouTube channel and they give me the boot for saying something controversial, which I know I've done a lot of, and I'm not ashamed of admitting so. Quite frankly, I think more people in the wrestling community need to have some balls and speak their mind about what they like and what they don't like about the product. But my whole point with the ramble is that since I've been back on YouTube, starting from basically summer of 2021 and up until now, almost February of 2023, it's hard to imagine that. But there's been a lot of stuff that's happened in wrestling in the last year and a half. Some good, a lot of bad. But in general, I think it's more of the behind-the-scenes nature of the wrestling business that's become more of the talkative facet of things. Whatever happens with the on-screen product, more often than not, I think it's safe to say a lot of the rational-minded wrestling fans would look at that today and say, whatever. It's SOT. Same old shit. You know, WWE's been horrible for years with the on-screen product. AEW's been a laughingstock since pretty much day one. They both suck, but they suck for entirely different reasons. But the bulk of the talk really comes with all the news that's circulated over the last 12 to 16 months. Whether it's the NDA stuff with Vince, him stepping down as chairman, and now as of January of this year, reinserting himself on the board. Probably in close development of finally selling the company, and the ongoing issues with talent morale, Stephanie leaving so abruptly. Or you could flip that on its face and look at the drama with AEW's locker room throughout the entirety of last year. People getting in fights, having different camps or friend groups that everybody kind of associates with. CM Punk in the media scrum. Jealous EVPs getting mad that there's another tag team out there that's better than them, God forbid. The whole thing's a power grab. And sometimes I wonder, Was it just happenstance that I managed to get back in the flow of doing these shows at a time when the wrestling business was at an all-time level of pandemonium and disorder? Or is the reality that the business has always kind of been like that? And it's the nature of having the internet now to where news spreads so quickly and becomes public. Which brings me to this little talking point that I was really stirring on over the last few days because I didn't exactly know how I was going to go about mentioning this or discussing it on the podcast. But on Tuesday, I think I was on my way home from work. I was just pulling in the driveway when I went to grab my phone and turn off the YouTube settings that I had going. I listen to music when I drive in the car, and I always have my YouTube playlists on. So I had the app open, and it was right before I went to swipe the app away where I saw an article pop up on the homepage, and I can't even remember what source it was at this point, but the caption read, Jay Briscoe unexpectedly passes away at age 38. And you know how it is with articles these days. You never know whether to believe them or roll them up in a ball and use them as toilet paper half the time. And at the time I saw that, pretty much every other wrestling source was starting to come out with the same breaking news, up to and including a lot of the major media outlets, like Fox. I think they had a quick article relating to that. And because it was too early in the development of the story, we didn't really know the particulars or the logistics of what was going on or how everything happened. So I waited about a day or two to hear the autopsy report on what exactly went down. Man, it just broke my heart reading that thing. You know, the fact that not only was Jay involved in the incident, but his two little girls. And I use Wrestling Observer's site as a basis for reading about everything. The whole thing just sucks. I mean, there's really no other way to bluntly put that. It's really one of the worst possible cases of wrong place, wrong time. But hearing about the two girls being in critical condition afterwards and Jay being dead basically upon immediate impact of that head-on collision. I mean, I guess Jay wasn't wearing a seatbelt at the time, which, I mean, I'm not even really going to go into that at this point. I could say it was irresponsible, but that isn't really the time or place to be venting about that right now. For his girl's safety, at the very least, he should have worn a seatbelt, if that's the case. Which is kind of what the reporting seems to be indicating, that he was not wearing a seatbelt device. And of course, the jury's still out on whether or not Jay or the driver that hit him was impaired at the time. Considering the time of day it took place, it doesn't seem likely. I probably more so bet on the idea that the driver that crossed over into Jay's lane was fiddling on their phone or doing something that obstructed their view from the road, like most fucking idiotic people do when they're driving. Trying to juggle a bunch of other things at once and not paying any attention to their surroundings. I'd like to sit here and tell you that it's an anomaly when you're driving on the road and you're kind of viewing what everyone else is doing, but sadly that doesn't seem to be the case these days. And I'll throw myself into the equation too. I'm guilty as charged. I do a lot of driving for my job, so, I'm constantly on the road and observing the stupidity firsthand. And, I do things occasionally where I'll check my GPS when I'm driving, or I'll have a coffee in one hand and trying to drive by holding the wheel with the other hand. It's stupid shit. Stupid shit that I probably know better than. But at the same time, I'm the only passenger in the seat, so it's like, if something happens to me and I die, that's on me, and I'm not putting anybody else in jeopardy that's in the vehicle with me. But, again, it's just a horrible situation to have happened, and I can't even imagine what his wife is going through right now. Hearing about your husband passing on top of the fact that your two baby girls are in critical condition at the ER. That's hard. I almost get choked up thinking about that, and they're not even my family. When we talk about how strange this world is sometimes, we were just talking about those 3 classic tag matches with FTR from last year. They literally just had the blow-off match. Final battle. Literally a month ago in December. And here we are a month later, and one of these 4 guys is no longer with us. For Mark, too, we haven't really heard anything from him yet. I'm sure he's going through a lot right now, so he's probably trying to stay under the radar for a little bit, and that's understandable. It's just hard to talk about. Because what do you say? I think AEW's already shot a tribute show for Jay for when they start up their Ring of Honor shows on that streaming platform, so, that'll be nice. The TBS executives, I'm sure they wouldn't sign off on AEW doing a Dynamite tribute show for him on television, because they're nothing but a bunch of gutless pricks. They're all still bent out of shape that Jay posted some mean tweets over a decade ago, so, they're not going to approve of Jay being featured on the TV show in person. Because that's where we are as a culture in 2023. When you share some nasty things on social media, and with the snap of a finger, they can essentially cancel you for ever having a voice. And we wonder why this world is so fucked up today. But Jay was obviously somebody that everybody in the wrestling business respected. And like I said before with Mark and Jay, those 2 guys deserve a lot of credit for being able to essentially carry and develop their entire careers, never having worked the big major American wrestling outlets. Whether it was the WWE or even being on AEW's primetime network, the Briscoes never made one physical appearance on a major American wrestling platform. And they still managed to become one of the best, most established tag teams in wrestling in the last 20 years. And I'll be the first to admit, and you can, for reference, go back and listen to when we were first covering the FTR Briscoes matches, because I think that was where I sort of delved into my discussion on my experience watching the Briscoes for the first time. But when I was really getting into the product and trying to follow the brand more extensively, this is going way back in the time machine, like 2009, 2010, 2011, that whole period. First time I saw the Briscoes, I really wasn't hooked on them. I think back to all those tag teams that were around during that time, whether it was Claudio and Chris Hero, Benjamin and Haas, even teams like Davey and Eddie when they were still the American Wolves. I was more impressed with those teams than I was the Briscoes. And it wasn't just a wacky persona that never really clicked for me from the beginning, but it was just the fact that their ring style didn't really hit home with me for a while. I still thought they were wrestling too much of the indie style, and that just really isn't my taste. They were doing a lot of what I would consider at the time the dive fest, no-sell, kick-out-of-everything style of match. Everything was very high-impact, big move, but the psychology wasn't always there. And I just really didn't understand what was so great about them back then. And it wasn't really until I started getting a little more clarity on the fact that Mark and Jay's gimmicks weren't necessarily characters, but that they were extensions of their own personalities, to where I started thinking, well, they're definitely a unique set of cats. And then I watched for that brief time when Jay was doing the singles run. They were presenting him as one of the top guys at the time. I think he was the Ring of Honor World Champion, if I'm not mistaken. It's been a long time. You're going to have to pardon me for not remembering that off the top of my head. But I just remember thinking, these guys are so unlike a lot of other teams or wrestlers on the roster. Maybe I'm not looking at this from the right vantage point. I'm analyzing them too much as wrestlers and not so much from the overall package. And by the time they shot that angle a year or so ago where they did the standoff with FTR and they kickstarted that whole program, that's where I really started noticing that maybe I was wrong about them. They had a truly different way of carrying and conducting themselves that was so unlike everybody else. And really, the whole thing just boiled down to them being themselves. They were just 2 rough and tough farm boys from rural Delaware. They were dem boys. but they were hardworking, extraordinarily passionate about what they did, and you could believe in them as wrestlers. Again, they had that unique ability to make you buy that when you saw the Briscoes on camera, you weren't getting two guys playing a character. You were getting the full picture. They were just themselves. And I think that's something that's too few and far between in today's product. We need more wrestlers that are extensions of their own personalities. The problem for a lot of wrestlers today is that none of them have personalities. Hence why they're all blander than goddamn drywall. But the Briscoes weren't boring. They were far from boring. And you know, when you look back at how great of a year 2022 was for Mark and Jay as a team, even though we'll never get to see Jay on this new ROH platform that Tony Khan's going to be relaunching soon, at least we can say that the Briscoes had their big blow-off win against FTR at the Final Battle show. They finished one of the greatest series of matches we've seen in wrestling in a long time. They won the ROH tag titles, and they got that one last moment to hold the belts together as brothers. I wish we would have gotten to see them get a fair shake in WWE or AEW, but at least we can say that that one dream match or program we'd all been waiting to see finally came to fruition. Think about all the missed opportunities of dream matches over the years that never came to be. Even something as recent as some of the stuff that CM Punk could have been involved with. His abrupt departure from AEW, say what you want about it, but there was still a lot of mileage to gain out of him. And you think about all those potential programs and feuds that just didn't happen. At least we can say that when it came to the FTR Briscoes matches, those were 3 great tag matches that we're going to remember for a long time. Even if they happen in semi-underground situations and weren't entirely built up well on television due to the spineless corporate execs, we got the matches. They were all worth the investment. So, I'm sure we'll get more development out of this story in the next couple weeks. At some point, we'll probably hear Mark come out and talk about it a little more on social media. But for now, I think we should just kind of let this stuff stay private, for lack of better terms. It's a healing process. You can't just expect everybody to come out and start talking about it publicly. But, again, all I say is thank you, Jay, for all your work and dedication to the business over the years. You will be greatly missed, but you'll still always be one of dem boys to me and everyone else. And I'll be honest here, I'm not going to really spend a whole lot of time with this AEW report. The Jay Briscoe news already kind of put me in a dour mood anyway, but I've talked about this before. I watch these Dynamite shows on delay. I just have no way to fit it into my schedule of watching these shows live on Wednesday. So I had the luxury of being able to fast forward through a lot of stuff. And when I was going through the segments and started glossing over a bunch of the crap that didn't interest me, by the time the fast forwarding actually stopped and there was anything on the show that even remotely caught my attention, we were pretty much closing in on hour 2. In an ideal world where things weren't fucking stupid, this would have been the opportune time to just change plans entirely and utilize the entire episode as a Jay tribute show. And again, because of the extenuating circumstances with the network, that wasn't going to happen. They were at least kind enough to let them throw up a 10-second graphic on the screen at the start of the show, which was very sweet of them. So already, before the show even started, I knew that I was already going to be kind of miffed about the whole situation anyway. Didn't help matters any by starting the show off with a company mascot. That about sent my blood levels boiling. And I could sit here and rant for another 45 minutes about the absolute joke and abomination that's Orange Cassidy on this show. But why even bother at this point? Do people still actually give a fuck about this guy? And I don't mean the marks in the crowd that would cheer for AEW if a tech guy walked into the ring and dropped a massive doozy in plain view of everyone. I'm talking about actual wrestling fans that genuinely, truly value the sport of professional wrestling, in the traditional sense. You all know I can't stand the guy, but even if I'm trying to analyze it objectively, seriously, has the novelty already not worn off with this guy? Beyond the fact that it's same shit, different week with this idiot, are we still operating under the idea that this guy means as much to AEW's TV product than he did even a year and a half ago when Tony Khan was constantly ramming the guy down our throats every week? Since then, he's considerably dialed back on how much he features the guy on TV, which I guess is a small favor. But now it's to the point where as soon as the guy's music hits, I don't even need to see anymore. I just jump forward with the show because I know I'm going to hate whatever I see. You know what you're getting with this clown. He hasn't changed a lick about his gimmick since the beginning. He's a one-trick pony, and it's not even like the initial shtick was good to begin with. And whereas before, I could at least semi-argue that the guy was doing well for them in terms of merch sales, we're beyond that point now. Now it is a matter of, why is this guy still a thing? Is he contributing to the overall bottom line of this company's growing success? He's been overexposed. He hasn't meant a damn thing with ratings. Viewership tends to decline when he's on camera, especially when they got the whole fucking peanut gallery out there with him, talking about Chuckle Fuck and Danhausen, that whole Carney clan. Also, he can go in there and defend that worthless Mid-Atlantic title or whatever it's called. And not just that, but beating Jay Lethal in the process. Like, are you kidding? They just got off that tag match with him and Jarrett versus the Acclaimed where it started to look like they were actually going to try to take those guys more seriously. Then they turn around and do this? Jobbing Lethal out again? This time to the biggest joke of an act I have on that entire roster? Fucking pathetic. And speaking of pathetic, the next match was Top Flight versus the Beta Bucks. Now that their best of 7 circle jerk session with Death Triangle is mercifully over, they just won the trios titles back with their partner Kenny Omega. You'd think that that would be something they would maybe want to celebrate on TV or talk about how much of a meaningful moment that was to get their belts back, to reunite as a trio, after having been stripped of them and having to work from the ground up to gain them back. Nah, instead a week later, they're just wrestling Top Flight for no apparent reason. Where was Kenny Omega? I have no idea. He never made one single appearance on the show. You got 2 young green kids that need experienced, competent veterans to help guide them and carry them. Teach them how to actually work a real tag team style with psychology and drama, milking big moments, playing to the crowd's emotions. So, of course, they put him in there with the Bucks so they could do their nonsensical video game-inspired match that makes no sense and it's just a bunch of moves that don't mean anything. And, of course, here's where the real logic comes into play. After just having worked a best of 7 where the Bucks and Omega were supposed to be the baby faces on their mission to regain their belts, a week later, well, of course, they're heels. For absolutely no discernible reason. They just woke up on Wednesday and said, let's be heels today. Because this shit's fake. No one cares. The crowd's going to cheer all our star-spangled awesome moves anyway, so we'll still get cheered. It's not going to make a difference. So in the end, it turns into a match where there's no clear-cut babyface or heel. Everyone's just reacting to moves, and it exposes everything that's wrong with modern wrestling. No one gets over, and nobody cares. By the way, that was a theme for the product or for the program this week. Just doing straight babyface matches pretty much up and down the card nonstop. Oh, and to make matters even dumber, straight out of the playbook of when the Bucks did business for that other tag team a few years ago. What was their name? I can't even remember at this point. Private Party? The fact that I can't even remember their name should tell you the whole story there. That's how little impact they've had in the company in the last 3 years. But yeah, Top Flight won this match clean with a flash roll-up. The exact same thing they did with the other young kids, where we all thought they were being put over and on their way to becoming one of AEW's top teams. They let Top Flight go over clean here for, well, I don't know what for. The Bucks literally just won the trios titles back a week ago. They put themselves through a grueling series of 7 matches with fucking everything but the kitchen sink thrown at it. And now they're losing TV matches to green underneath tag teams in under 15 minutes because, well, it's like everything with the Bucks on TV. Nothing makes sense. There's no coherency to anything they're ever involved with. And my bet is that nothing really comes out of all this. Top Flight got this clean upset win over the supposed top main event team in AEW, even though we know that they're not the real top team because we know who the top team is in AEW. And while we know the Beta Bucks were never going to do another job for FTR, at least we know they're nice enough guys to do jobs for their friends. And again, what comes out of all this? Probably nothing. My bet is that Tony will get bored with Top Flight again at some point down the road and he'll stop featuring them. Or one of them will get hurt again doing some stupid flip or dive and they'll be out again for another 6 to 12 months. And this win will be completely worthless in the end. That's what I make of it. And you can all admonish me in the comments section about a year out from now when we realize that this didn't make a lick of difference. Much like Private Party beating the Bucks clean on TV didn't make a lick of difference. But you'll all think I'm crazy. That's the funny part. In the meantime, though, I guess we have this to look forward to next week on Dynamite. Family Therapy. Featuring the Acclaimed and the Ass Boys. Sounds like some riveting content on the way. And as much as I'm a fan of both these teams, got to admit, a family therapy sit-down with the AEW Tag Champions and a semi-undercard tag team? Anyone else hearing the WWE warning bells flashing? I don't know. Maybe it'll be good. Highly unlikely. But maybe. You know what wasn't good? Ricky Starks versus Jake Hager. Why? See one of the aforementioned names. Jake Hager. When they announced this a week ago, the first thing that hit me was, okay, you got a roster with like 300-something guys on it, and your genius idea to hook in viewers for the following week's episode of Dynamite is by putting Jake Hager in a featured match. Jake Hager, the former Jack Swagger in WWE, one of the worst world champions of the modern decade. I have gotten more enjoyment out of counting inventory in a warehouse than I ever have watching a Jake Hager match in my entire life. And it's not even the fact that the guy is boring as all get out, but sorry to say, it's as simple as the association with the JAS at this point, where every time I see Hager on camera now, I know it is nothing but a big fucking joke. The stupid purple hat, the goofy crap he's associated with on TV every week. It's impossible to take the guy seriously. Because he clearly doesn't care. He's just there to pick up a paycheck. That's very obvious now. You know, and as big a fan as I am of Ricky Starks, I knew from the minute, from the very second they tried to pair him in this feud with Jericho, I knew it was only a matter of time before they wound up ruining his push. Because that's what Jericho is at this stage. He's an energy vampire. He just sucks the life out of everything he's involved with. Quite frankly, I wouldn't be surprised if we see Jericho come out with a full cape and vampire wings. With a fucking spitting out blood like Gangrel used to. I mean, Jericho's taken every other gimmick in the book. Might as well just become a full-fledged vampire on TV. At that point, I would have seen it all. But seriously, I mean, not even trying to make a joke out of it. He saw that Ricky was gaining traction, and he was the first to jump on that bandwagon to make sure that he flatlined his momentum. And it's not even to really say the match was horrendous or anything, but it's the nature of where we are with the whole Jericho thing. I've been over it for a long time, but like Orange Cassidy, as soon as that fucking god-awful Judas music hits, I immediately disengage myself from what's going on. I just don't care. Everything with Jericho just makes me groan. And you know they're going to milk this program for all it's worth. I mean, that Revolution pay-per-view isn't until March. I have no idea how they're supposed to keep it interesting for the next 2 months when they've already kind of hot-shotted virtually every part of the program in the last 3 weeks. I mean, they've already done the massive beatdown on Ricky and his sidekick, which didn't amount to anything. They've already had Jericho light a fireball in a dude's face. So what do they have him do now? Skin Ricky alive or hog tie him to a railroad track? I don't know. And what's it all actually building to the pay-per-view? Another one of Jericho's genius-inspired anarchy in the arena debacles? Because that got over so well the first time they did it, right? Damn near crippled and ended Bryan Danielson's career because of it. But if there's ever a way for Jericho to prolong his involvement with anything on TV, he'll be the first to take advantage of it. So after that, they did Bandito versus Bryan Danielson. Once again, another textbook example of why you don't do babyface matches unless you have a real rhyme or reason to do them. I mean, remove your mark mindset from the equation for a minute and just try to think about this with a little bit of common sense. If you're using this as a way to advance a storyline, you have Bryan Danielson in a current title program with your top heel champion. You're supposed to be doing everything to garner sympathy on Danielson, having to run this gauntlet of wrestling every week on TV from now until basically February 8th. Because he wants the title shot in March, right? So the stipulations is that he has to wrestle every week from now until the 8th of February. Okay, fine. We can get behind that. So instead of them milking some actual drama and doing everything to get people to want to cheer or get behind Danielson every step of the way, throwing obstacles in front of him, sending some handpicked bad guys at him to either injure him or put him out of commission, thus preventing him from actually earning said title shot, instead they're just putting Danielson out there in 50-50 matches every week on TV where there's no real struggle, there's no real story, there's no real drama. It's just him going out there and wrestling. And while there's nothing wrong with the idea of seeing Danielson wrestle per se, well, you start to run into problems with babyface matches where instead of getting the crowd to unanimously back Danielson having to overcome any odds, now you get circumstances like this where Bandito winds up becoming the de facto babyface, and people start booing what Danielson does. All because of the Mark booking mentality of wanting to do Bandito versus Danielson because, I don't know, it sounds cool. And again, I go back to what I said last week when Danielson had that match with Takeshita. If the story here is that Danielson has to win every match from now until the 8th of February to get that title match with MJF. Who's booking the matches? Is it MJF or is it Tony Khan? If it's Tony, why? And if it's MJF, who probably in kayfabe should be booking these matches, why is he not choosing heels to have Danielson wrestle? Guys that are bigger than him, guys that are stronger than him. Why is he not sending out a pack of mean guys to jump Danielson in the back before the match? Or putting a bounty out on him? Wouldn't that make more sense? I mean, this whole thing just comes off as lazily executed in the storytelling department. There are so many components to making a story like this work, and right now they're just butchering it. They're going about it the completely wrong way. This is a good wrestling match. Very good match, in fact. But it didn't mean anything. It was a cold babyface match where we knew what the finish was going to be. Again, there wasn't any real drama or emotion to it. Like I noted, the crowd wound up cheering for Bandito's shit more than Danielson, which I didn't understand at all. If the idea is to build up Danielson as your top babyface challenger, booking him in a match where he's getting booed for the majority of it doesn't seem like a wise move. And I know you can't really control the way the crowd reacts to things, but you can certainly monitor it. You don't book shit like this. And here's the other thing. From where we are right now in the story, we've had 2 weeks of Danielson having to go through this gauntlet of sorts. So far in the journey, he's had 2 lengthy, relatively difficult matches against, and even though the marks will see it differently, in the eyes of the casual viewer that's watching on TV, are 2 underneath guys that really don't matter in the grand scheme of things. Takeshita was a dude that showed up for a while, wrestled a couple competitive matches, but he never won. Bandito's had like 2 or 3 matches on Dynamite since he debuted, and none of them have meant anything either. Last time we saw him, wasn't he doing a job to Jericho? So what does he really mean at the end of the day? I'm just having a hard time wrapping my brain around the way they're constructing this. I mean, maybe I'm just trying to analyze it too logically, and that's my problem. But for something involving MJF and Bryan Danielson, I would expect this to make at least a hair of sense. You know, at least next week, it looks like they're finally going to pin him up against an actual heel. Granted, it's Brian Cage. And I'll say this outright. If Danielson can get a watchable, passable TV match out of Brian Cage, they should just have MJF forfeit the title and hand it over next week. It'll certainly be the best thing Cage has ever done in AEW. At the same time, it'll probably be the weakest thing Danielson's ever been involved with. Because trying to get a good match out of Brian Cage is like pulling teeth. But maybe Danielson will make it work. Tell you what, MJF did a good job motivating him in the pre-tape, offering Cage a large sum of money to break Danielson's arm and then slapping him across the face as hard as he could. I wouldn't want to be Danielson right now. Cage's voice doesn't match anywhere close to his physique, but he still looks like he'd be able to rough someone up. So that was at least good. But I don't know. The dynamics of this program are just off right now. Then we had some girls' content that I happily kept my thumb on the fast forward button for. Kind of know what we're getting with them at that stage. And after the match plugs for the upcoming shows and a backstage pre-tape where Takeshita screamed at MJF in Japanese for about 10 seconds, the main event was Darby Allin defending the TNT title against another Japanese sensation, Kushida. Y'all remember Kushida, right? The guy that was supposed to bring so much promise to WWE for the Japanese market, and nothing ever came of it. Kind of like how they said the same was supposed to happen for guys like Kenta or Shinsuke Nakamura, and that never happened either. And I like all three of those guys. Nothing against them personally. Of the three of them I just mentioned, Nakamura was at least the closest to actually becoming a breakout star in the American market. We could say this. At least Nakamura made it to the main roster. I don't even think Kenta or Kushida made it that far. Kushida's good, though. I saw him in NXT for all those years. I mean, nothing he ever did was really bad. They just didn't really book him to, I guess, to his fullest potential. I have no fucking clue how this match came to be or why it was booked, other than accounting for Tony Khan's ADHD. For me, the best part of the whole segment was seeing Sting come out with Darby and Tony Schiavone butchering his job of dropping the "It's Sting" line. I mean, at least Taz had some fun with it. Where the hell has Sting been lately? I don't know. He got a heck of a pop when he came out here. One of the biggest ovations on the entire show. Might be shocking to hear, but yeah, Sting is a much bigger star than most of the people on this roster. As was Billy Gunn. But, as far as the match goes, it was fine. Take out the fact that it didn't mean anything, and we're probably never going to see Kushida again after this. What they did for the most part was good. I have no idea why Kushida's dojo trainees were at ringside. They were apparently there just so Darby could do a giant plunge onto them from the top rope. You ever notice that AEW does a lot of that? Everyone will just have random people that accompany them to ringside. Most of the time, they're barely ever addressed or recognized, but then they just wind up getting laid out like geeks anyway. So no one gives a shit. Everyone's a punching bag in this company. I'll say this. It was a humorous visual of seeing Kushida actually look like a sizable wrestler standing next to Darby. In WWE, Kushida was working with a lot of bigger guys, so the size difference was always more noticeable on camera. In there with Darby, he looked like fucking Andre. Everything they did was fine up until the ridiculous spot on the floor where Darby tried to dive onto Kushida back first, and then Kushida immediately locked him in the armbar. Meanwhile, they're out there on the floor while Kushida has this armbar applied, seemingly for well over 30 seconds. Meanwhile, Bryce is in the ring going, 1, 2, 3, 4. I was like, could you please go fuck yourself? These are the worst officials in the entire history of wrestling. Every single one of the AEW officials. Dumb. Worthless. Futile. Incompetent. Moronic. I could go on and on. I hate them all with a passion. A passion. Suck. They suck. Oh, and I should mention, after the spot they did on the floor, they just rolled back in, kept doing more stuff. After Darby practically had his arm ripped out of his socket for almost a full minute, they just get in there and keep doing stuff. So at the end, Kushida goes for the hoverboard lock, and then Darby counters it and then pins him with the Last Supper. Again, not that there was any real suspense to the finish. I could do another rant about them booking their 17th babyface match in a row when there's no clear-cut guy to cheer for. I guess you could argue Darby was the default babyface because he was getting his arm worked over, but seriously, does that mean anything? Especially when the people are still cheering for almost anything Kushida did. I just don't get wrestling anymore. Everything is all about cheering for high-impact moves and spots. We've totally bastardized this sport to the point where as long as guys do impressive-looking stunts, it gets over. Even if it doesn't make sense, which the majority of the time it doesn't, Guys risking limb and life to pull it off. Look, I just think. Darby did what was essentially a backsplash from the top rope out to the floor. Came down as hard as he possibly could onto his back. Probably did some pretty significant damage to his spinal column. And for what? Just a totally random spot in a match that meant absolutely nothing and led to them just doing stuff a minute later. But whatever. I've long since given up thinking any of these idiots are ever going to get it. I said I wasn't going to spend a whole lot of time talking about the Dynamite show this week. How do you even judge it? On a scale of anything other than, look at all the impressive stuff guys did in their matches. Look at all the cool moves. I look up and down the card and I'm like, yeah, there was some impressive stuff they did. But what was the logic or reason behind any of it? Orange Cassidy versus Jay Lethal for a totally worthless belt. Why? Top Flight beating the Beta Bucks in a total throwaway match with no build-up or prior announcement. In the middle of the show. Why? Ricky Starks beating Jake Hager at least played into the storyline with Starks and the Jagoff Asshole Society. I still hate that feud, but at least that had a purpose. But Danielson versus Bandito? Babyface versus Babyface? Why? Darby Allin versus Kushida in the main event for the TNT title? Babyface versus Babyface? Why? Really, why? That was like my main takeaway from Dynamite this week. Overall, I just looked at the card and I said, why? Aside from the Starks-Hager match, I don't remember them ever announcing any of the matches a week ago. They were all just kind of haphazardly thrown together because, again, they sounded fun to do. All right. I'm not even saying doing cold matches is a bad idea, but even in the booking department of things, I still don't get why you job out the Bucks when Top Flight never win anything to begin with. You just put the fucking trios titles on them a week ago, and now they're losing to an undercard tag team. The same Top Flight that just did a job to Moxley and Claudio not that long ago, right? But here they're beating a well-established tag team? And as much as I hate them and think their matches suck, it still didn't make any sense. Kushida randomly showing up to wrestle Darby for the TNT title on Dynamite's main event? Like, out of nowhere. Just at the beginning of the show, hey, Kushida's going to be here. Okay. Wouldn't you maybe want to announce that a week in advance just to possibly garner some extra viewership? God forbid there were any people out there that may have tuned in to see Kushida that didn't know about it until 5 seconds before you rang the fucking bell for the match. I just don't understand this formula of booking. The whole hotshot mentality just never clicked with me. And never will. And I get this is how Tony does it. Whatever, we can argue or debate whether it's right or wrong. All we can do is judge it based on the numbers. Does it increase viewership? Does it garner attention? Does it keep people watching? Does it do anything long-term to help grow or build the product? The jury's still out. But people are going to get so hung up on the greatness of the moves, they're going to completely neglect the fact that not a single one of these matches they booked is going to do anything to sell tickets for the fucking pay-per-view. Mostly because they barely did anything on the show to build to the pay-per-view period. And where was Adam Cole this week? I mean, you had to make that big surprise appearance and have him cut that great promo a week ago. Where was he here? Not on the show. They devoted a 15-second pre-tape to him. That was it. That was Adam Cole's big return to television after being out for almost 7 full months. last week, didn't I remember saying that was a pretty good Dynamite? Remember how I was talking about how it was very unlikely they were going to follow it up with 2 good shows in a row? Case in point, Moxley and Hangman Page had that really good TV match that opened the show. Where were they this week? Moxley was MIA. Adam Page had a minute-long interview in the back with Renee Paquette. But was he actually physically here in any capacity? Doesn't look like it. Your main event last week, a TLC match where Kenny Omega and the Bucks won their belts back, the trios titles. Where was Kenny this week? Just not on the show. FTR, MJF, where were they? Not physically on the show. Oh my God. Again, the Mark booking mentality. It's just, this formula is not working. I don't know how many bad shows this company has to produce in a row to get people to just wrap their brain around the concept that hotshot booking is not a good mentality. It's never worked. It's never worked in the entire history of the wrestling business. You want to know why WCW isn't around anymore? It's called hotshot booking. I mean, there's a lot of reasons WCW is not around anymore, but this certainly played into that part. And again, the people watching Dynamite now, they're going to watch no matter what. So you don't need to appeal to that audience. But again, we talk about this all the time. AEW needs to grow as a brand. They need to be more than just a second-rate knockoff of WWE, which is what they've been for the better part of 3 years. They need to do better. This is a new year for them. AEW had a horrible 2022. Just a downright awful year for that company. Now's their chance to really turn the tide. Shift things around. Do better. Have stronger booking. Develop some characters. Make the show worthwhile every week. You're not going to get there by doing this, Tony. You had one good show last week. You looked like you were making steps in the right direction. And then you immediately resorted back to the wrong formula. This is not going to serve you well in the long term. And I'm not an expert talking about it. I'm just a geek on the internet. But if you ask actual experts that have experience in the business, that did this for well over 20 years and know what the hell they're talking about, they might not stray too far of the talking points that I'm presenting right now. They might say it in a different light, but the bullet points are going to be there. So, you're calling the shots, man. But so far, it just comes across like same old stuff with this product. And that's not really what I want to be watching with AEW for another 12 months. It's time for this product to actually do better. It's time for them to actually grow and expand. So this was week 2 of my streaming experience on the iPhone. And let me tell you, if there's ever a way to make yourself feel old and crusty, it is trying to watch a long-form wrestling program on a tiny little monitor. That was quite the eyesore. And I think I figured out what the issue is that's preventing me from being able to stream everything on my computer through Peacock. Really, it boils down to something as simple as my computer not being up to date with the latest versions of the browsers I normally use. And the problem is that I think at this stage in the game, unless I go out of my way to just buy a whole new computer, I think I'm kind of stuck with the phone streaming. My current Mac model dates all the way back to 2015, and I don't think my machine has the memory capacity to update at this point. My Chrome browser keeps telling me that I don't even have the ability to do updates because of the version of the browser I'm using now, and I have no way of doing it manually, even if I try to go into system updates. That's crazy to think I've had this computer for almost 7 full years now, but it still runs like a charm. People talk about the capacity of computers these days. People say that they have their machine for like 3 or 5 years before it starts giving them the old kaput. I've had this thing for 7. Now, granted, I don't really use it a whole lot. It's not like I'm giving constant wear and tear on it, but still, that's a long time for a computer, especially these days. So, I've never even thought about the idea that, hey, you probably might want to invest in a new version of the MacBook Pro at some point, because, you're going to need to upgrade. That's kind of the selling point of Apple products. They just keep plunking out new versions of the same thing to make you keep coming back to buy them. Man, just when I was thinking of buying a new mic, too. But don't mind me, I'm just venting. We got through this one, though. So while it was a minor inconvenience having to watch these things on the smartphone, I think I'll be able to withstand it for a little while longer. Nothing is going to hinder the retro review portion of the podcast, damn it. No matter how hard they try, technology, you can stick it. And certainly not when World Championship Wrestling is in the middle of teasing Ric Flair and Barry Windham. How's that for a transition? Yes, sir. Our cold open for this week, about 4 months ahead of the actual showdown between the two at the 1987 Crockett Cup, Ric Flair and Barry Windham have turned up the heat in their feud. We got the Horsemen running roughshod during a post-match brawl. Flair's got Ronnie Garvin in the figure 4. And at the point Barry gets in there and stands nose to nose and toes to toes with the Nature Boy, all it took was one slap from Flair to set this thing in full motion. One of my personal favorite Flair-Windham matches of all time, and we're coming up on it relatively shortly. And again, man, it's still crazy to think just how far in advance they used to plug these programs. We're in January of 87, and the Crockett Cup isn't for another 3 months. And they've already got their main title program booked and set in stone. And it's hot. It's red hot. So, as we go to the studio to kickstart everything, Tony and David are running down a few things for the program, including the 2 big announcements that this show will feature the on-screen debut of Lex Luger. And in addition, we will also be seeing an exclusive interview with Magnum TA in the coming weeks to provide everyone with a health update. He's recovering, he's getting better, and we'll get to see him talk about everything in person very soon. Which was a good segue into bringing out Dusty for a promo here. Now sporting the buzz cut look. I guess I haven't been too vocal about that on the recent Superstation reviews, but yeah, Dusty was in dire need of a haircut for quite some time. And he was essentially out there to call out Ivan Koloff, and to a lesser degree Vladimir Petrov. Told Ivan that the day he brought Vladimir over to the United States and landed at the airport, he should have been grateful for the opportunity to even walk on this land. He's been running his mouth on Nikita Koloff for a while, but Ivan should never forget that Dusty and Magnum were responsible for shaping Nikita into the man he's become today. And if Ivan has a problem with that, he doesn't need to come looking for Nikita. He can either come looking for Dusty personally, or he can send his big, jacked up, ugly monster to come get him. And Dusty promises to rip his nose off, live and in color. And it's not all that important, but I jotted this down anyway. Dusty always looked so much better with the shaved head. I'm still not sure about the whole biker look he had going on here with the leather jacket and the bandana, but I don't think you've ever heard me claim that Dusty had a great taste in style either. So then we cut to the ring for our opening bout. Ravishing Rick Rude and Raging Bull versus the team of Rocky King and not Bill Tab, but William Tab. Because that was apparently a thing a lot of these job guys had going on at the time. You see the same enhancement guys pretty much every week, but every so often they try to throw a curveball at you by changing their names around or trying to modify the spelling in certain places. It was very odd, and I'm not entirely sure what prompted him to go from Bill Tab to William Tab. Personally, I think Big Bill Tab has a better ring appeal than William Tab. Just doesn't have the same vibe. It's not badass. Unless he was coming out with Handsome Jimmy and he was looking for an excuse for everyone to call him Willy Tab. I should note here, despite the name change, David Crockett was still referring to him as Bill Tab. And, well, you'll be shocked to hear this, but William Tab, Bill Tab, doesn't matter. He still got brutalized in there. Manny and Rude hit him with a double-team backbreaker at one point, which was quickly followed up with Rude giving him the Rude Awakening DDT for the pin. Only other thing I noted was the couple of moments where Rude was actively trying to pull up his tights from the back to hide the massive tan line he had going on around the waist. That was at least comical. And then all three of them had a follow-up interview where the only thing I gathered out of it was Paul Jones saying something about Rude and Bull not being closet champions. I don't know what that means, nor do I even want to venture a guess. And then while Rude was trying to cut a promo on the Road Warriors, the crowd led on a chant that I believe I heard for the very first time in my life and probably never heard again for as long as I've been watching this business. They all chanted, "We don't want to hear, we don't want to hear." That was a quite fascinating chant. It's basically the PG version of what fans would say in today's buildings where they're telling guys to shut the fuck up. But back then, the studio audience actually had some class and dignity. But, yeah, we don't want to hear. Very amusing. And, Manny also said something here, but as soon as he started talking, my stream started to buffer pretty badly. And by the time I gave up fucking around with it and trying to get everything back on track, I just skipped ahead to the start of the next segment. I'm sure whatever Bull said was not all that important. So I came back for this Barry Windham promo, and he was sort of recapitulating everything we saw in the opening VTR. Said he was just trying to come out and save a couple of his buddies. Looking back now, I'm starting to think that the guy that Flair had in the figure four was not Ronnie Garvin, because Barry was mentioning something here about Tim Horner and Denny Brown as guys he was trying to loan a hand to which I said, if anybody else out there forgot that Denny Brown was a thing on this program, I don't blame you. It's been eons since we've seen that guy on television. But I guess he was involved in that whole Horsemen beatdown from the taping. And they showed a little bit of the fallout to the standoff between Flair and Windham, which apparently became what Tony referred to here as a verbal agreement match. So when they cut to the video feed, Windham and Flair were basically in the middle of an impromptu match. I assume non-title. Also in turn, wound up turning into an unannounced lumberjack match with the Horsemen, Dusty, and the Rock and Roll Express on the floor basically getting involved and throwing both guys back into the ring whenever they would get dumped out to the floor. And it went pretty much as you'd expect a Barry Windham Ric Flair unadvertised fight to go. Barry beat the teetotal fuck out of Flair from basically start to finish. Flair got in the occasional points where he cut off Barry momentarily, but It was a pretty status quo Ric Flair match. His goal was to let Barry shine and make him look like God. And while Flair's taking the beating and getting whipped like a government mule, to coin an all-time legend, Barry ends up getting Flair in the figure four toward the end. And while Tommy Young is talking to Flair, J.J. Dillon reaches in through the ropes and gouges Barry's eyes. From there, Flair's able to milk a little more heat on Barry and work him over. Of course, he tries to do the spot where he goes up top, but gets cut off with the overhead throw. And it eventually leads to Barry decking Flair with the lariat from out of the corner. And right as Barry's going for the pin, that's when everybody hits the ring, baby faces and heels alike. And the chaos ensues from there. The heels are eventually cleared out of the ring one by one, which leaves Dusty, Barry, and the Rock and Roll Express standing tall in the ring. It was quite the spectacle. The end goal in all this was to put Barry Windham over as one of the biggest baby faces on the roster. And, by the scope of the crowd reaction alone, I'd say they succeeded in that department. But to tell you the truth, this was just an appetizer in the whole Flair-Windham program. Anyone that's seen these guys wrestle before knows what remarkable chemistry they had with one another. And whether it was the stuff they were doing here in early '87 that led to the Crockett Cup in a few months, or even some of the work they were doing in the early '90s once Barry was fully elevated into that main event status, these guys just clicked on every level. It's a much similar dynamic with the Sting-Flair feud. We all remember the classics those two had over the years, and you could put those two together in programs off and on over the years, and they'd always be able to tear the house down. But what made the chemistry between Flair and Windham extremely important was the fact that these two had close ties when they were doing business together in the Horsemen about a year or so out from now. So even at the points they weren't feuding together, they were still constantly working together as teammates. And, you'll see as we follow the pathways with these two in these classic reviews, you'll start to see how perfectly matched these guys were for one another, whether they were teaming or feuding. Now, to be fair, Flair's kind of had the reputation over the years for being able to get a good match out of virtually anybody he worked with, but trust me when I tell you, Barry was unique. All the traveling and all the time these guys spent with one another on the road, you can tell how much Barry gained and absorbed from being able to pick Flair's brain and get all that knowledge he did about the business. Speaking of Flair, he was out here after the break to comment on everything we just saw previously. And in very genius, typical Ric Flair delivery, he's sure to spend a minute putting over Barry Windham as one of the best in the sport of wrestling today. This young gentleman took Flair to the limit, and for that, he deserves credit. But what sticks in Flair's craw is David Crockett mentioning at the end of the video that Barry was, quote, the winner. He tells Barry that he may be great, but he's no different than the laundry list of every other guy that's tried to prove their worth at the expense of Flair, trying to be the world champion. To be world champion, it's not just about the money. It's about wrestling the best of the best day in and day out, night after night after night after night. Hashtag no days off. Well, he didn't actually say that, but I figured I would throw that in there for clarity. And, well, it was a damn fine promo. Basically, it all boils down to the idea that Barry doesn't have what it takes to handle the pressure that comes along with being world champion. He's too young and inexperienced to be riding high every day and every night. And while maybe a lot of that held true in 1987, give it a few years. You look at the career development of Barry Windham and where he was by, say, 1991, 1992, even 1993. Totally different story. It's probably where I imagine they wanted Nikita to be before he kind of got burnt out on the whole wrestling thing and walked away altogether. But this is a phenomenal series of segments they shot here. I also got a kick out of Flair's closing line where he said he'd be hosting Space Mountain auditions at the Holiday Inn after the title match in Jacksonville. Because, got to make sure we get in those pump and dump plugs in there. So then we went to the Kansas Jayhawks versus Allen West and Eddie Roberts. I wrote, incredibly boring match. Chance for Allen West for some bizarre unknown reason. Jayhawks are heel with about 5 question marks. And Bobby Jaggers won with a clothesline off the ropes. I'm just going to move on because I have no further input. Did they ever wind up doing jack shit with Dirty Dutch and Bobby Jaggers in the NWA? They're another set of dudes that just randomly showed up late last year and haven't really done anything on TV aside from a few squashes. I vaguely remember they were being programmed in with the Midnights at one point, but that never really went anywhere aside from one TV match where I think the Midnights won, if I remember correctly. But these guys are getting the Dick Murdoch treatment right now. Go out there, wrestle for 2 minutes, win, and occasionally cut a generic, pointless promo. But coming back, we had another pretty great moment on this week's Superstation show. The Crockett Promotions TV debut of Lex Luger in a suit and tie, looking quite spiffy for the occasion. And if you followed Luger's track record for the previous 2 years, you would know that he spent a period of time down in Florida getting some exposure before he made his way up north to Atlanta. Still pretty young by this point. Still what you would call a puppy with big paws. For everything we look back on with Lex Luger's career in wrestling, the goods, the bads, the indifference, Luger really lived up to his moniker of the total package. Not just factoring the obvious statement that he was built like a Greek god. And, while his promo skills were always kind of shaky throughout his career, he wasn't ever really the best promo, but, he definitely had his moments where when he was fired up, he was pretty good when he wanted to be. This particular promo was one of his more timid, greener promo deliveries. He basically put over that he has credentials, established that he is the total package, a gimmick that lived with him for the entirety of his wrestling career. He said he came to Crockett Promotions to wrestle the best and beat the best. He also came for, and I quote, financial aspects. Mentioning that he's had his eye on the Horsemen for a while, and among the fiscal reasons for him wanting to join Crockett Promotions, among the fact that he wants to take on the best of the best the business has to offer, he also has goals and ambitions to be a member of the Horsemen. And he's very blunt in his delivery. Makes no bones about the fact that he came to Crockett Promotions to be a Horseman. And Tony and David are briefly shocked by this revelation, so much so that they don't provide any further input before pitching it to the ring. But if you know where it's going in story, well, without outright spoiling it, Luger was not kidding. He wanted to be a Horseman from day one of joining Crockett Promotions. And we've been signaling for a while now that the Horsemen are about to undergo a series of personnel changes in the not-so-distant future, so it all comes together. From there, we went to the ring for Barry Windham versus Thunderfoot number 2. I guess the original Thunderfoot tagged out for lunch. I actually don't know if I ever looked up who the original Thunderfoot was in Crockett Promotions. It's one of the greatest mysteries of all the masked men since Mr. Wrestling 1 and 2. No, actually, it's really not that interesting at all. But Barry went over with the clothesline in a couple minutes, and they followed that with a cool little angle where he immediately goes to the booth and mentions how he overheard Luger mentioning his goal to be a Horseman, but since Luger's the new kid on the block, he needs someone to smack a little sense into him. So he's telling Tony and David that Luger doesn't want to be a Horseman. So he's going to go hunt him down and talk to him, because that's a decision that he does not want to make. And I just like how in story, Barry Windham has made the executive decision that Lex Luger does not want to be a Horseman. After Luger made it abundantly clear that, yes, in fact, he wants to be a Horseman, Barry follows up with, no, the fuck you don't. I mean, it's funny in its own right, but considering Barry's ongoing affiliation with the Horsemen right now in storyline, it's just another piece of the puzzle that ties it all together. Some good stuff coming up, too, with the Luger-Windham program, because that is another thing that we'll be seeing more of. After the break, we had all members of the Horsemen out for a promo, minus Flair. JJ was sporting some of the dollar here, and they zoomed the camera in on this to the point where you could clearly tell that these were absolutely fake dollar bills. So whatever I said a couple weeks back when JJ and Tully were flaunting the 10 grand on TV, how that was probably real money, now I'm starting to have second thoughts, because that did not look like real money. Anyway, so JJ chimed in on the VTR from earlier. Didn't really write a whole lot down about what he said because I was focused on the fake money he was holding. Ole basically promised that the Horsemen were going to cut Barry's nose off and wrap it around his neck, to which I noted, sounds extraordinarily painful and time-consuming. He also mentioned here that by the time the Horsemen are through with Windham, there are going to be 4 men and a manager standing at the top of the mountain looking down on all the people they've laid in a broken heap. Notice how he never explicitly mentioned who the members of the Horsemen were going to be. He just said, 4 men and a manager. What you may call the art of foreshadowing. And at that point, we went back to the ring for our next match. By the way, if you're asking yourself, why were Arn and Tully out there if they did not say anything? The answer is, I don't know. I guess just to get them on TV for a bit. But get this next match. We talk about how apparent it was that they had absolutely no game plan for Captain Redneck Dick Murdoch on these Superstation shows. Here's the match. It's Dick Murdoch teaming with, of all people, Baron von Raschke. Can anyone even recall the last time the Baron was on TV? It's been well over 2 or 3 months by now. The last thing I remember seeing Baron involved with on the show was the angle they shot where he abruptly turned babyface on the Paul Jones army, after which they barely followed up with any of it and Baron completely vanished. Now he is back here teaming with Dick Murdoch to wrestle Randy Barber and Gary Royal. And the look on Murdoch's face here told the entire story. What in the absolute fuck am I doing with my life right now? He's now been relegated to teaming with the borderline immobile Baron von Raschke circa 1987. The match was hideously comatose. Baron von Raschke could do virtually nothing physically. It went about an eternity and a half. I think Christ's resurrection took place in about the amount of time this match went. There were approximately 4 young gentlemen in the front row that were the biggest Captain Redneck fans in the world. They marked out for virtually anything the guy did, and it was kind of hilarious because everybody else was completely quiet. And finally, at the end, Murdoch gave Barber a stalling brainbuster for the 3 count. And I'll admit one thing. As boring as this match was, as completely random as it was seeing Captain Redneck team with Baron von Raschke on the Superstation, and despite the fact that the match was never ending, Murdoch has still got one hell of a brainbuster. That I cannot take away from him. Then we went over to the booth for the Road Warriors, Animal was here calling out Rick Rude and Manny Fernandez from their promo early on, saying that the Legion of Doom has a response to the tag champs, asking if they have anything inside of them. Animal says they have hatred and rage. And while Rude and Bull have had everything handed to them on a silver platter, they don't know what real struggle is like. But they'll find out soon when the Road Warriors get in the ring and rip them limb from limb. Hawk starts retreading a lot of what he said last week about being sick of wrestling a bunch of slugs in the NWA. And for Rude and Bull, they're yet to prove their worth as World Tag Team Champions until they get in the ring and fight the Road Warriors. He says that the bottom line comes down to getting in the ring and fighting. And the bottom line under the bottom line is winning said fight. And I thought he was going to go the extra mile and say, and the bottom line under the bottom line under the bottom line, which is still under the bottom line. But he basically just promised that the Road Warriors were going to eat Rude and Bull for lunch. Something, too, about Hawk saying that if they want to eat Twinkies, they will. And if they want to go out and slaughter a cow and eat it raw, they'll do that, too. And I believe one of his last lines, not making this up, I wrote this down verbatim, quote, "Cuts are for kids. Bulk are for big boys." And just like that, Hawk became the newest sponsor for Kellogg's. Or am I thinking of General Mills? Whatever in the fuck company does the Trix cereal. Doesn't matter. You get my point. It was a goofy Hawk promo. How about that? Not as goofy as Precious Paul calling Los Angeles La La Land. That was a line that probably never should have seen the light of day. You write that one down on a notepad. Keep it on the notepad. Don't actually verbalize it. At that point, we came back from break for a Midnight Express and Big Bubba versus Larry Stevens, David Isley, and Ronnie Angle six-man tag. Ronnie Angle. Put a note on that for a second. Just let that one simmer for a minute. By far, our highlight of the show was the first common interaction between the announcers and Jim Cornette here, where Cordy goes over to the booth and tries to acknowledge how great he looks on camera today. Tony Schiavone, with the perfect babyface retort, he goes, "Yeah, looks like Ripley's Believe It or Not." Boom! Mic drop. Tony Schiavone. Put that one in your pipe and smoke it, Max Caster. You ain't got nothing on the hipster Tony Schiavone. Delivering classic lines like that circa 1987. And we say Tony still doesn't have it. Well, that's exactly what I'm saying. He clearly does not have it anymore. So, of course, they ring the bell for this, and within the first 15 seconds, Tony Schiavone says, "Well, we got to go to break. Stay with us." I'm like, you literally just came back from a commercial a minute prior. What the fuck was this random commercial break needed for? You didn't get enough sponsor plugs in the previous 90 seconds? Lord knows I needed to sit through another god-awful State Farm infomercial on Peacock. I don't even know what advertisements they would have been running in 1987 on TBS. David Isley had the best spot in this match by far. Bobby Eaton goes to whip him off the ropes before he tags in Bubba. And as soon as Isley hits the ropes and starts running back, he sees Big Bubba in the line of fire. So he just stopped running. That was straight out of the playbook of the barbed wire Christmas tree match in TNA years ago, where one of the guys was about to get Irish whipped into the barbed wire tree. So in order to prevent making contact with said tree, the guy just stopped running. A novel, never-before-seen concept in all the years I've been watching pro wrestling. Somebody finally figured out the idea that you can just stop running. Fucking brilliant. David Isley figured it out. So, going back to the Ronnie Angle comment for a minute. Remember how I was making that joke earlier on in the show about guys randomly changing their names for no discernible reason? Bill Tab becoming William Tab, even though they still ended up calling him Bill Tab during the match. Turns out that Ronnie Angle was actually Tommy Angel, who wrestled on last week's show against Brad Armstrong. Same attire, same look. They just decided when they were putting the show together, for whatever reason, let's call him Ronnie Angle this week. Even though Cornette ended up referring to him as Tommy Angel during the match multiple times. The hell was going on with the production team around this time? These guys were not clued in well when they were piecing these tape shows together. And for the record, Tommy Angel is a much more suiting name than Ronnie Angle. Unless he was Kurt's long-lost uncle that we never heard of until now. I also smiled at the Sissy Cornette chants. I'm sure Bill Watts was howling up a storm in Oklahoma. And after the Midnights had their way with these three schmucks, they finally put them away with the rocket launcher, with Bobby Eaton doing the best pinfall of all time, with not being able to decide how he wanted to place his finger on the guy's chest. Classic beautiful Bobby right there. That was followed with a Midnight's promo, where Cornette rapidly said about 1,000 words in less than 2 minutes. Here's what I got out of it. Something about promoting the cage match with Dusty and Big Bubba Rogers in Pittsburgh, 27th of February. Something about Dusty looking like a squished tomato after Bubba rams his head through the cage multiple times. And his closing line was great, where he said, "Dusty, just because your breath smells like cheetahs doesn't make you Tarzan, boy." And I'm not kidding, I had to rewind and listen to that again because the first time I heard it, I could have sworn I heard, "Just because your breath smells like Cheetos." But he did say cheetahs. I think that even got a pop out of Bobby Eaton too. And Bobby was the highlight of this whole thing. I couldn't help but keep getting distracted by him because while Tony is holding up the mic to Corny, Eaton is also jaw-jacking with Tony. And I think at one point, Tony actually got fed up with Eaton's bullshit, and he basically gave him the hand to just stop being a jackass. And I think that also cracked Bobby, because then he just started laughing uncontrollably. Oh, man. Rest in peace, Bobby. Ain't nobody else like you. Truly one of the all-time greats, even though it's never really recognized enough. And I'm not just saying that because I'm a Midnight's mark, but Bobby Eaton was very special. So at this point, more buffering issues. More of me sitting on my couch, motherfucking Peacock for being the worst streaming service of all time. And then once we got everything back up and running, Ivan Koloff and Vladimir Pietrov were out for a promo. Once again, they were back to the image of filming Pietrov while Ivan was cutting the promo. And again, if the end goal in all this was to make Pietrov look striking and intimidating, it failed. He was certainly a mouth breather, though. That was very apparent. In terms of what Ivan said, he basically called out Dusty and Nikita for being scared of Pietrov, refusing to get in the ring with him, and he essentially vowed that Dusty and or Nikita would wind up with a brace around their neck after Pietrov gets done with them. And I'll tell you, with a face like that, how could you not be concerned about Dusty and Nikita's well-being? So then Pietrov proceeded to kill Zane Smith in one of the worst 60-second squashes of all time, wherein he managed to royally fuck up a backbreaker to the knee, He kind of sort of butchered his second rope Russian sickle, although at least this time he got better footing before he jumped off the turnbuckle. So that was no good. And while Zane Smith was pretending to be dead in the ring, Ivan did another heat promo on Nikita and Dusty, vowing they were both going to feel the wrath of Russian justice. All I can say about it is they tried. That's the best I can give it. But with Crusher Darso out of the picture, it really didn't leave them with many other options to keep the feud with Ivan and Nikita fresh. So they kind of had to swallow the bitter pill and make do with what they had access to. Unfortunately, the best they could come up with was Al Blake. Not the best choice. After this, we had more continuation with the Lex Luger Horseman story that's been developing on the show. J.J. Dillon basically comes out and puts over the fact that he's flattered that Luger's interested in joining the most elite group of professional wrestlers today. However, as of now, they aren't really looking to expand the group in terms of members. But JJ is willing to come out here and scout Luger's debut match just to see what he has to offer. Said a lot of other stuff here too, but it all just kind of boiled down to JJ rambling more than anything else. I did like his line about him getting anywhere in the ballpark of 50 to 200 calls every week from random people asking what it takes to be a horseman. I just picture JJ lounging back in his office somewhere getting heckled by a bunch of nerd marks trying to be members of the Four Horsemen. That's a VTR I would actually like to see them film. Just J.J. Dillon admonishing the public, saying why modern wrestling fans aren't worthy of being members of the Horsemen. Because you're poor, you're weak, you're inferior. That'd be fun. But then we went right over to the Luger debut match, and they picked the right guy for him to go in there and wrestle. They said, Luger is greener than goose shit. Who is the most credible enhancement guy we've got on this roster that'll make him look like $1 million? George South it is. And he pretty much did that. They pretty much did everything here to mask Luger's weaknesses and showcase the strengths. Weakness, wrestling ability. Strengths, being a fucking genetic freak of nature. And if you have seen any Lex Luger match in your entire life, the signature Flexi Lexi poses were in full effect here. As soon as he took off the robe and showed his perfectly defined body, all the women in the audience immediately creamed themselves. Beyond that, though, this was practically every Lex Luger match you've probably seen in your entire life. Luger had one thing in his arsenal that became the most influential part of his gimmick. The finishing torture rack. He did some basic power moves for about a minute, but as soon as he slapped on that rack at the end, they established from day one that this was Lex Luger's move. And from that point onward, anytime somebody was put in the rack, you could pretty much guarantee game over. Now, granted, it did not get a pop like it would in the later years when he actually established that move as his finish, but as a grassroots debut match, this was pretty much a Lex Luger match in a nutshell. He really didn't need to do anything more than what he did in this match. Because of the fact that he was built like Zeus, he could pretty much get away with this style of match for his entire career. He was such a presence in the ring, it was easy for them to kind of smoke and mirrors a lot of the drawbacks early on in his career. Now, yeah, he would obviously get a lot better over time, but in the ring, I mean, there really wasn't a whole lot to it beyond what we saw here. Just crank up the fan reactions in the later 90s whenever the rack became the most over part of the gimmick. You know, and his follow-up promo was mildly uneventful. kind of reiterated his talking points from earlier and said that he's done his homework on the Horsemen and he's looking to get in. He's here for the money, the fame, and the accolades. And with the Horsemen on top, they'll be Luger's best option for him to climb that ladder and take him to the promised land. But it's during the middle of his promo where Barry Windham interrupted to try and talk some sense into him. Talked about how Luger mentioned he's done his homework on the Horsemen, so that should also be a clear indicator to demonstrate what the Horsemen have done to a lot of the guys on this show, whether it's the heinous attacks on Dusty, Garvin, even Windham. But Luger basically blows him off and tells him to go pound sand without actually being so blunt about it. So Barry just kind of walks off and tells Luger that he can't deal with this right now. And Luger affirms that he's one of the biggest attractions in wrestling today, and we can bank on the fact that he will be a Horseman. As noted, it was not the strongest delivery from Lex. Probably also didn't help that he was massively blown up. From a match that went 2 minutes, by the way. But they got across what they needed to. This is kind of one of those bigger programs they book in early 87, especially with everything leading to the Crockett Cup. But, we're still in the super early stages here, so the Luger-Windham thing still has a while to develop on television. Then we had Tim Horner versus Thunderfoot number 1. Guess the OG Thunderfoot clocked back in from his piss break. And at this point, I was really starting to feel the fatigue from the length of this program, so I very half-heartedly paid attention to this match. Horner went over with the bridging pin. That's all I got. And then Jimmy Valiant was out to literally profess his love to the entire world. He, in fact, loves his fans so much, if he were walking down the street and someone from the other end of the sidewalk waved hi to him, Valiant would run over to the other side of the street just to shake their hand and have a bite to eat with them. At which point, I envisioned the idea of Handsome Jimmy walking somewhere in downtown New York City just doing his wacky little dance. And at the point somebody gets his attention and says hi, Handsome Jimmy would just cut in the middle of traffic and run over to the other side to greet that person. Fuck his safety and well-being. For Jimmy Valiant, getting the chance to say hi to a stranger in the middle of New York City, that's what he lives for. We also got the great bit at the end where he attempted to give Tony Schiavone the key to his heart, only to realize that it was the key to his actual house. And while he wraps up his plugs for promoting everybody to come support the Boogie Woogie Man in his hometown, he concludes this by attempting to plant another wet one on Tony's face. And after months and months of this, Tony sells it perfectly by going, "Don't do it, Jimmy." But at that point, it was too late. Handsome Jimmy had firmly wrapped himself around Tony and began molesting him in front of the entire world. You would think at some point that if Tony was actually bothered by Jimmy kissing him every week, he'd have maybe filed a restraining order by now. But hey, maybe Tony is secretly into it. I don't judge. Up next was Gorgeous Jimmy Garvin versus Bill Mulkey. An opportune time for Precious to sterilize the air of all the germs that Handsome Jimmy was spreading about a minute ago. Speaking of Precious, I noted here that this might have been the greatest impromptu handicap match of all time, wherein one of the participants never got physically involved, but was still the best part of the whole segment. Basically, here's the layout. Garvin toyed around with Mulkey and kept dumping him out to the floor so Precious could admonish him and talk about how much of a bum he was. And the best part is that she never had to touch Mulkey to make it great. Her just constantly nagging him and talking about how much of a geek he was made the whole thing worth it. Now, granted, to be fair, if she did this with any other generic jobber on the show, probably would not have been as funny, but the fact that it was a Mulkey brother, that's what made this great. It makes me glad, too, that we're reviewing the world-class shows at the same time, because we're already basically 3 years into the Garvin Precious on-screen pairing by now. Like, she only recently debuted in Dallas as Garvin's official side piece, now that he's dumped Sunshine. So, we're only really seeing the beginning of how great these two would become on television as dastardly heels. And I've noted this many times too. It's just going to be very unfortunate when Jimmy finally turns babyface in like a month. Because he's been such a damn entertaining heel with everything we've ever talked about from his work, whether it's Crockett Promotions or World Class. And, while Jimmy definitely had a good face run, it's just not going to have the same effect as when he was being the smug, cocky prick every week. He's so good. So damn good. So at this point, when I saw that the next match was Brad Armstrong versus Vernon Deaton, I wrote down the following. Child, please. We're burning daylight by this point. We're an hour and 15 minutes into this fucking program, and I'm watching Brad Armstrong versus Vernon Deaton with like 10 minutes left of airtime. At this point, I was just venting. They wrestled for a few minutes. Brad won with the leg sweep. I noted the spot in this match where Deaton completely fucked up taking a standing drop kick from Brad while he was on his knees. I have no idea what the hell happened here, but clearly these guys were not on the same page. They weren't even in the same stratosphere. Brad cuts Deaton down to a knee, and he goes to give him just a regular drop kick. And Deaton just decided, for whatever reason in that moment, you know what? I'm just not going to sell this fucking drop kick. And it made for one of the worst television moments we've seen on the Superstation in a long time. There have been some bad squashes here and there, but this one was like exposing the business level bad. So, if someone did not either chemically castrate or hang Vernon Deaton after this taping was over, I'd be shocked. And then we went to the booth for a Nikita Dusty promo, wherein the only thing I gathered out of it was the following statement I wrote down. Nikita was wearing a t-shirt given to him by the Road Warriors that read, Weasel Slappers, Weasel spelled W-E-A-S-A-L. Weasel. Oops. I mean, I guess in kayfabe, English was Nikita's second language, so maybe we can forgive him for the misspelling. And to be fair, he and Dusty did have two back-to-back fiery promos here that were damn good. Nikita called out Ivan and Vladimir to come fight him because he's ready to get it on. And he was apparently so ready to get it on that he finished his promo and then walked straight to the back. Then Dusty fired up on Lex Luger, claiming that he was here to be a horseman, telling him to check himself, because if he wants to associate with the big-time stars in the NWA, ain't no one more big-time than the guy that was on 230 magazine covers and drew the biggest gates for wrestling in the last 10 years. So, well, at least we know from night one that Luger wasn't on Dusty's good side. But that's two back-to-back promos from the show, or on the show, where... But that's two back-to-back promos on the show where I actually understood the majority of what Dusty was talking about. Maybe it was a good luck charm that he was sporting the biker look. He should do it more often. Gives him a better sense of clarity when he's cutting promos. By the way, I love the idea here. You got these two guys that are firing off at these great, super gritty promos. And of course, Tony just goes, all right, stick around. We'll be back for more. Classic Tony Schiavone. After which, we had Flair back out for a promo so he could heckle some of the young kids in the front row for a few seconds about sleeping in his dress shoes. But more importantly, he was out there to dish out some comments to Flexi Lexi. Takes a few moments to put over him and talk about how if he wants to be a member of the Horsemen, he's got a lot to prove. He put over Luger's suit from earlier, saying that he's already taken steps in the right direction by dressing like a Horseman, but now he's got to put in the work. That's all there really was to it. Of course, got to throw in the Space Mountain plugs for good effect. And that took us to the greatest rib of a main event we've ever seen. Tully Blanchard defending the World Television title against Randy Mulkey. Meanwhile, poor Bill Mulkey's getting served up to Jimmy Garvin on a silver platter. How did Randy land that gig? Did they flip a coin? No, in any case, Tully beat the shit out of him. You had all the Horsemen out at ringside berating Randy Mulkey, saying he'd never be a Horseman, but he can certainly be a member of the Superpowers. At which point I began thinking of all the missed opportunities for the NWA to make Randy Mulkey a Four Horseman. Think about all the incarnations of that group over the years. Christ, wasn't fucking Steve McMichael a Horseman at one point? If they were ballsy enough to make Mongo a Horseman in the late 90s, then they could have given Randy Mulkey a minute or two in the spotlight. Just think about all those classic Randy Mulkey, Arn Anderson tag matches that we never got. So when about the time it took me to envision Randy as a member of the Four Horsemen, totally beat him with the slingshot suplex, at which point I wrote down, sadly, Randy failed at capturing the 10 grand. But who knows? Maybe they'll give Bill a chance next week. Then we wrapped up everything here with a Horseman promo at the booth, this time minus Ole. Arn talked about how everyone in the NWA claims to be the best, but what makes the Horsemen stand out from everybody else in the pack is that they're the one unit that proves to be the most cohesive group in all of Crockett Promotions. They eat together, they train together, and with all that brain power working as one, it's no wonder why guys like Luger won in. Tully reiterated his awesome talking point about how the Horsemen always have the ability to lowball and cheap shot better than anybody else in the business. So when they get sneak attacked, they know how to fight back. And it accounts for why the Horsemen have all the gold, the fame, and the fortune. And I did have to note here too, JJ, while these guys are cutting these promos here, I'm just laughing to myself the whole time because JJ is tucked behind everybody else in the background, never says a word, but all he's doing the whole time is flaunting around the money by his face, just to make sure that we all know the Horsemen are very wealthy. So much so that they can afford to post a $10,000 award to anybody that can successfully beat Tully Blanchard for the TV title in under 25 minutes on TV. What an amazing set of heels these guys were. Can't say it enough. They truly were the most unique and elite group. Especially this first incarnation with all the members where they were all basically on an even playing field in every avenue of the sport. Whether it was promos, ring work, personality, they were all so evenly matched. And it's crazy to think in all this, because, we've done a whole year of these NWA reviews on the Superstation now, but when you think back to the longevity of the Horseman timeline, the original 4 core members with Ole, Arn, Tully, and Flair, throw in JJ as the manager, they were really only kind of a full unit for maybe about a full year. Before they started altering teammates and going through all the roster rotations, the original 4 guys we all like to reminisce about so much pretty much were only around for about 12 months. And by early 87, Ole was out, Luger was in, and the group went through so many twists and turns where it's kind of hard to keep track of all the changes in the Horsemen over the years, especially by the time you get to the early 90s. Just, one of those things you pick up on as you go through the archives and see all the stuff taking place with modern eyes. But I think we've overstayed our welcome with the Crockett review, so let's try and get some of this world-class analysis underway so we can get this baby in the editing bay. You've heard me mention with some of the world-class reviews in 83 how some of the episodes weren't particularly all that eventful or worth deliberating on. This one was kind of in the middle of the playing field where there were still a handful of things to discuss. However, when I look back at the entire runtime of the 45 minutes, my notes about the particular segments were not all that meticulous. Now, part of that also could have been me trying to cram in watching this episode right after I got home from work on Thursday night, after an essentially 11-hour workday. So, I was not particularly lively while watching this episode. But them's the breaks sometimes. Still, we'll try to make it as reflective as possible. Starting with the opener, for example, on paper, doesn't look like anything all that thrilling or striking. It was Kamala wrestling in a squash. However, when you look a little deeper and you realize the man he wrestled, that's where the conversation gets a little more interesting. His opponent was actually an individual who recently debuted for Crockett Promotions at the tail end of 86. At the time of our current retro review timeline, is also currently one half of the World Tag Team Champions alongside the Raging Bull. None other than Ravishing Rick Rude. Only in World Class circa 1984, he was not Ravishing Rick Rude yet. And in fact, he wasn't even Rick Rude, period. He was Rick Rudd. Yes, let me repeat that name. Rick Rudd. R-U-D-D. A last name that also rhymes with things such as mud and crud and dud. So suffice it to say, that name didn't stick. They couldn't have at least given him the moniker of Rick the Stud Rudd. No, it was just Rick Rudd. And when I saw that graphic on screen, well, first of all, it didn't make a lick of sense to me because it read Rick Rudd, and I was like, why would you call yourself Rudd when your actual name was Rude? Spelled differently, of course, with a gimmick last name, but the pronunciation was still the same. Who the fuck decided that he should go by Rick Rudd in Dallas, of all places? Now, aside from the quirkiness of that, he still looked like $1 million. Still in damn good shape physically. And of course, he didn't get to do much here. He was just ham fodder for Kamala. And at this point in his career endeavor, he was probably only a couple years into his actual career. I don't really remember a whole lot of what he did prior to his run in Florida in 84. This might have been one of the few appearances he actually made in Dallas as an enhancement guy before he left for a while. Because he comes back to Dallas about a year or so later for another brief run, and obviously by 86 he's in Crockett Promotions for another brief stint. Then finally he jumped ship to WWF in 87. And then there was the stuff in WCW in the early 90s too. The guy was definitely around the horn between basically now until 87. And it's sort of an interesting tale of Rick Rude's wrestling journey when you go back and look. Never really staying in one place for an extended length of time. He was in Florida for a little while, then he went to Dallas for about a year, then he went to Crockett Promotions for about another 6 months. Then basically from 87 until the end of his career, he was bouncing back and forth between the two big promotions in WWF and WCW. but he was always moving from location to location constantly. And, of course, we know about the tragic heart failure and the drug overdose that led to his death. The guy had a rough life. But every territory he worked for and every company he was a part of during his career, he always made an impact. And I've talked about this a little bit before, but I think it's a shame that he never really reached what I think a lot of us would deem his fullest potential, especially in the WWF, man. Like, there's always a part of me that thought, with the look that guy had, with the ability he had in the ring and on the mic, he could have easily been a main eventer at some point. Just never came to be. And while I know we've spent more time discussing Rick Rude's career than the actual match here, well, hey, we killed two birds with one stone. So now we don't have to do another 5 minutes Cliff's Notes rundown of Rude's legacy after he leaves Crockett Promotions in a few months. So following that 2-minute squash that we spent approximately 10 minutes recapping, the follow-up segment was a quick VTR to highlight the big angle from last week, that being the Chris Adams-Jimmy Garvin angle, where Garvin attacked and dropped Adams with a suplex in the middle of the ring, and that preceded what was intended to be a Chris Adams-Black Gorman singles match. And as we remember, the match still ended up happening, and Adams still won in very convincing fashion by the end. So Gordman proved to be a complete scrub. But Adams and Sunshine had a babyface interview with Mercer to kind of recount that whole charade. Adams basically promised that he was going to be the American heavyweight champion and that he'd put a stop to all of Garvin's antics. Sunshine, who by the way looked just grand in that fluffy white coat. Anyway, she added some fuel to the fire by vowing that Garvin and that tramp valet of his would be ridded from world class. That was the only way they were ever going to get even. And the only reason this segment was remotely memorable was for that tramp line. Take that out, I probably would not have recalled a single thing that went down here. Not because it was bad, but it was just generically dull, which can probably sum up a lot of Chris Adams' promos. He was a very soft-spoken kind Englishman. He does the promos, but they never really had a lot of oomph to them. They were just kind of meh. Serviceable, but not particularly gripping. Moreover, they use this VTR as a way to promote one of their featured bouts of the program. Gorgeous Jimmy Garvin wrestled Kevin Von Erich, a match that I believe we reviewed close to 850 times in the last year alone. Sometimes you go back and watch these Dallas shows and you start asking yourself, are we sure this was a recently taped match and that they're not airing something on delay from like 3 or 4 months prior? I mean, don't get me wrong, it was good. It was a prototypical Jimmy Garvin match. Aside from all the usual stalling and cowering, Garvin also got his ass handed to him for the majority of it. It was also another one of those cases of a match where you got 3 parties involved. You got Garvin, you got Kevin, and you got Precious. So, of course, who is the most over talent in the entire segment? Sunshine. So for the first 10 minutes, it's kind of just your average, regular, standard Dallas TV match. It's Kevin working over Garvin and keeping him grounded for the most part. And right at the very end, at the point where Garvin was not even remotely in control of the match, Sunshine and Chris Adams just start walking down the aisleway to run a distraction. They get on the ring apron, where Garvin tried to throw Kevin over the top rope to the floor on the other side of the ring. Kevin skins the cat while Garvin goes over to argue in the opposite corner with Adams. And from there, you have Kevin sneaking up and giving Garvin the bridging suplex off the ropes for the 3 count. I wrote, this was a very clumsy, not so graceful execution of the finish, but I got what they were going for. I did love the post-match deal where you got the heels and the faces doing the Mexican standoff. Garvin is comically clutching his fists and challenging Adams and Sunshine to get in the ring and come get some. And as soon as the babyfaces cross the ring ropes, without hesitation, the heels immediately turn and run for the hills. They say, "Nah, fuck this. We are out." So it was effective here for what they were going for. I still love the whole idea of this feud being the actual title program is Jimmy Garvin and Chris Adams for the American Heavyweight title, and the fans do not give a shit about anything the guys are doing. All they want to see is Sunshine wrap her hands around Precious's throat. Titles, pinfalls, fuck that noise. We came to see a sloppy catfight with the girls. Hey, man. I'm not going to sit here and argue with that outlook. You ask me what sounds more enticing on paper between guys having a professional wrestling match and girls trying to claw each other's eyeballs out? I mean, I may have to stew on that one for a while, but I think I might take the girls' fight. But that's just me. Then we came back for an Iceman promo ahead of the main event. And he's recounting everything that's gone down between him and Skandar Akbar in the last couple months. This issue between the Iceman and Devastation Inc. all started because Akbar couldn't stand the idea of the Iceman beating the Super Ds. So what did he do as a result? He tried to brand the Iceman by lighting a fireball in his face, ending his career. And the fact is, this is no longer about championships for the Iceman. It's about revenge. It's about redemption. It's about settling the score once and for all. So the Iceman's got a big surprise for him later on. And that big surprise, none other than a literal big surprise. Andre the Giant, making a rare appearance in Dallas to join alongside the Iceman King Parsons as his partner for later on. And Andre let us know he is here for nothing more than extra reinforcement. But the Iceman is calling the shots. He's going to hang in the corner and follow orders as needed. He is not the team captain in this situation. And to be fair, I probably summarized that a lot better than Andre's execution of the promo, but that was the gist of what he said. And this isn't really groundbreaking news for 2023. Kind of touched on this a little last week when we were mentioning the plug. But when it came to Andre, especially before he signed with the WWF later in '84, he truly was the single biggest attraction in wrestling at the time. All the traveling and all the bouncing from the territory to territory he was doing in the 70s and 80s, never being locked down to exclusive contracts with certain promoters or organizations. He literally was the epitome of a touring attraction. And you see it even him making a rare showcase in Dallas in early '84. Just by association, he gave this match a real main event feel. Funny enough, too, because Andre pretty much followed protocol of what he promised from his promo earlier. He let the Iceman kind of carry the load early on and work over the Super Ds. Andre ends up getting the big tag in the early stages, and the heels immediately try to retreat to avoid him at every turn. And obviously Andre was over like God in most places he worked around this time, so anything he did here, crowd went ballistic for it. Even during spots where he would just stand there with his giant boot pressed on one of the Super D's hand. Or him doing the head collision spot with the heels on the apron. One of my favorite spots in the whole thing, the spot where Andre and one of the Super D's tried to do the drop down. Andre went to stick his ass out so one of the Super D's could come off the ropes and hit him. He ran straight into Andre's ass and took a bump. And then Andre did a hip shake to the crowd and everyone ejaculated themselves. Generally, for the most part, the heels just bumped and sold like pinballs for the babyfaces. They got a brief bit of heat on the Iceman during the midway part, and obviously that was done to milk the hot tag to Andre. Of course, it was all fun and games for Andre here until the heels tried to paintbrush him on the apron. And when he actually gets in there for the second time in the match, now he's cranking up the intensity and just throwing these lethal open hand slaps to the chest of the Super Ds, just beating him from pillar to post. They do the big spot where Andre gives the Iceman the assisted crossbody attack onto both heels in the middle of the ring. And that's where things basically broke down at the end because Kamala ends up running down for the blatant DQ. And he goes after Andre. And they're working over the baby faces for that 3-on-2 advantage. Pretty much lasting all for about 8 seconds before Andre and the Iceman ran everybody off. And they had this great post-match angle where Andre and the Iceman are in there shining each other's boots with one of those polish rags. You know, in the comedies that when Andre goes to put his boot on the Iceman's knee for leverage, the Iceman starts selling the weight of Andre coming down on his knee. Because, again, he's huge. So they had a good laugh about that. And I noted here, one of the few times World Class could get away with a satisfying DQ finish. Crowd didn't care. Like, fucked finish. Doesn't matter. The babyfaces won. They ran off the bad guys. They stood tall. That's all that matters, man. The basics and fundamentals of wrestling. But it was fun seeing Andre here. You know, it's one of those moments you go back and relive and think, that guy truly was a special talent. People often talk about attractions in wrestling and the kinds of wrestlers that always had a presence when they were on camera. Man, did Andre fit that mold. I mean, he was a legit presence no matter where he worked. And, you know, the height thing, obviously, that's a literal take on it, but his matches, even his matches had a different aura than everybody else's. Like, you could do shit with Andre that you could not always pull off with normal average-sized guys. Whether it was bumping around for Andre and selling for him, whether it was getting thrown or jerked around, you know, having face-offs with him around the ring. There were so many unique qualities about Andre's matches that weren't always attainable or compatible with other wrestlers. And again, his matches were just different. It always gave the crowd a real chance to invest in what was going on because they knew that they were going to see something distinctive. It's hard to really compare that with what you see in today's product of special attractions because, you know, let's be honest. Who are the special attractions in wrestling anymore? Roman Reigns, maybe. Although he's nowhere near Andre's level, as great as Roman is. You know, Brock Lesnar gets thrown around as an attraction-type talent. That's more so because we rarely ever see him work. But, you know, he's been so overexposed for years now, and I've kind of been over the whole Brock Lesnar thing for a long time. Ronda Rousey had a unique presence on the female side of the equation a few years ago when she was white hot and fresh. And then she came back last year and they totally fucked up her run and just made her like every other generic, bland, talentless hack in the girls' division. So really, what does she mean at the end of the day? Really, who else do you have? You know, you start going down the roster and, you know, unless you start diving into names like Steve Austin or The Rock, and as much as I've thoroughly enjoyed the work over the last year or so from guys like Pat McAfee or Logan Paul, would I even put those guys on a similar pedestal as guys like Andre? Hell no. Not even close. You know, it makes me really wish I'd gotten the chance to see Andre in his prime, man. Because when that guy was physically well and he could move, he was so damn good. You know, even by this period in his career, you could tell he was slowing down astronomically, didn't have the best stamina in the world. By 85 onward in the WWF, he was a hurting unit. I mean, it was pretty much all downhill for him health-wise. He was a physical wreck. And it's still hard to think that he was only really alive for about another 9 or so years after this point. You know, his age was starting to wane on him. His body was breaking down here. He was slowing down considerably, but the way his health declined so drastically as we got to the mid to late 80s up to the 90s, it's really sad to even think about. And again, This is kind of the issue with going back and looking at these classic shows with modern context. How we'd possibly perceive something like this in 1984, it drastically alters from how we'd review it in, say, 1994, 2004, 2014, or even 2024. All those years to reflect back and think about the historical impact this all had on the business. It comes with pros and cons, I guess. But, it's been a long haul for today. Not the most cheerful of podcasts, even though I made it a mission statement at the beginning of the year to try and make this more entertaining. Are you all entertained? Sorry if this one didn't do it justice. But it's been a hard news cycle in the last several days. It's, I don't know. Wrestling, it's a weird animal. Goes through stages of ups and downs, and things can change so frequently. You get good news every now and then it can immediately turn on its face with a cycle of bad news. Like I said, I think the problem with the last couple of years in wrestling is just the bad news kind of outweighs the good in a lot of cases. Just the nature of where we are. But with that said, you can always make sure to keep posted with the FSWR content every week, Mondays and Fridays. So this coming weekend, it's going to feature our 1994 Royal Rumble review, as well as the follow-up episode of Retro Raw. As I said last week, if you watched, we will be excluding the SmackDown report from the Monday show. So if you're all looking forward to me hearing, or if you're looking forward to hearing me vent about that program, you'll have to hold off for probably another week or two. I'm still contemplating whether or not I even want to do a SmackDown report the following week, considering that that'll be the go-home show for the 2023 Rumble event. Because that's happening next Saturday. More than likely, I'll probably hold off with the SmackDown reviews until the beginning of February, until Rumble season's kind of cooled down. The problem with the go-home shows is that a lot of what I say by the time the pay-per-view's over is just, it's kind of old news at that point, so it's like, why even bother talking about it? But I do want to stay consistent with the retro shows. If I skip out on a SmackDown here and there, I won't be bothered by it. I mean, I skip 80% of the stuff on the shows anyway, so what am I really missing at the end of the day? But I'll keep you posted with that. So for Monday, you can expect a 1994 Royal Rumble recap and a thorough Retro Raw review following that. So it'll be historically heavy over the next couple weeks, but again, we'll talk about the 2023 Royal Rumble next weekend as well, so you'll get your fair fix of WWE content in there too. But thanks for watching. Take care all. Peace out.